welcome all for coming here. We're so glad that you all showed up to one of the really fundamental issues facing California, a discussion of it. And I'm very happy to have Jeff Kightlinger here, who's the General Manager of the Metropolitan Water District. Jeff has been at our editorial board a couple of times to talk about MWD.
I have difficulty hearing you.
Okay, I'll speak closer into the mic then. Yeah. Like I say, Jeff has been to our editorial board a couple of times to explain his view, the Metropolitan Water District's view of various issues related to water in California. And I invited him to come to more of a public forum. It's the way I view it is kind of a public version of what we do at our editorial boards. I'll of course ask you folks to ask a few questions. But he understands that the Sacramento region is not particularly friendly, at least many people here are not particularly friendly to the MWD. So I appreciate that he has decided to come in and kind of come to the Lion's Den and explain MWD's view. And so with that, why don't I turn it over to Jeff to make a few opening comments, and then I've got questions, and I'm sure some of you folks have questions as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Pleasure to be here in the so-called Lion's Den. So let me tell you a little bit about the agency, because a lot of people don't really follow water that closely, and they may not necessarily know that much about Metropolitan. So Metropolitan Water District, Southern California, we're a public agency. We were created by the California legislature in 1928. And the purpose was to go and build an aqueduct to the Colorado River. So in 1900, the city of Los Angeles, about the same time, the city of San Francisco was starting to look towards Hetch Hetchy. You had the East Bay looking at the McCollum. The city of Los Angeles looked to go build the Owens Valley Aqueduct going up to the Owens River, and built that system, and they thought that was going to be enough water for about 50 years. But already by the 1920s, that system came online in 1913, and already the growth in Los Angeles by the 1920s was outstripping it. And so they looked around for other supplies of water, realized with the technology at the time they could go to the Colorado River, but the city of Los Angeles, even though it was rapidly growing, could not afford it on its own. So they needed a new regional cooperative system, and the theory was they were going to bring in the neighboring cities, which at the time were places like Glendale and Burbank and Pasadena, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills. They got together, 13 cities agreed to go co-fund this and go build the Colorado River Aqueduct. The interesting thing was Metropolitan was founded in 1928. But when we went to the market to go get money to go build this, it was 1933. And the world was slightly different between 1928 and 1933. And yet, amazing thing, Southern California voters, by a 10-to-1 vote, agreed to go tax themselves for a decade to go build a project that was 10% of the entire assessed valuation of all of Southern California. It's unheard of. It was a huge, massive undertaking. $220 million in 1933 dollars. And the project delivered its first drops of water 1941, 75 years ago this month. So a huge undertaking. Said it was going to be done for another 100 years, probably never need another drop of water. And already from 1941, by about the mid-50s, we're starting to see this is going to be a challenge with the post-war boom. And that was when Governor Pat Brown decided that they wanted to go build the California Water Project, State Water Project, which would tap into Northern California. Fiercely debated at Metropolitan at the time because, again, the expense for it was pretty staggering. But after a long internal debate and a significant amount of arm twisting by the governor, Metropolitan agreed to bankroll 50% of that project for 75 years, the most expensive project ever built at its time. And we signed a contract that said Metropolitan will pay half the costs of the State Water Project through 2035 for 75 years. And put in perspective, Metropolitan's annual budget's $1.8 billion a year. We write a check to the state of California for the State Water Project, typically around $550 million a year. And that's a 75-year commitment. So rather staggering, but that built all your facilities, Oroville, the State Water Project coming down Highway 5, the pumping and all the reservoirs and systems throughout to supply Southern California. So those are the sources of water for Southern California. Metropolitan supplies about 55% of all Southern California's water. It comes from two places, the Colorado River and Northern California through the State Water Project. These are massive systems, and they supply, we measure water in acre feet. Metropolitan supplies a little over, close to about 2 million acre feet of water a year to the 4 million acre feet of all of Southern California's demand. The other half of our water, our local rivers, our local groundwater basins, our little bit of 8 to 12 inches of rain a year we get. And so that's kind of where we get our water. Metropolitan supplies about half of it, and that's kind of where we stand today.
So clearly the Twin Tunnels is a project that MWD supports. And as near as we can tell, you are other than the governor's office, the main supporter of it. Can it happen with just MWD, and should the rest of the state accede?
So,
yes,
several questions in there, Dan.
There you go.
I think it's more accurate to say our board has supported the process. So what our board has done is basically we've taken a hard look at how we get our water through the Delta and to the State Water Project. And what we have right now is a status quo that we don't think is working for anybody. It doesn't work very well for Metropolitan, it doesn't work for agriculture, it doesn't work well for the environment. We are in constant debates and battles over what is the right outflow, what are we doing for fish, why is the habitat disappearing every year. Regardless of how much money we throw at fishery issues, it seems to get worse every year. So we have been very supportive we were very supportive of the 2009 Delta Reform Act that led to a process. This is the process we're in. This process has led to a preferred project, a recommended project of the Twin Tunnels. But we don't still have a final project. Our board has not voted and said we're really willing and able to spend money to build these tunnels. What we've said is we're going to support the process, get to a conclusion, hopefully soon, and assuming it's the Twin Tunnels and assuming it's a fair package that Metropolitan's paying the right portion of, then I assume we'll be supportive of it.
So what in your view is the timeline here? I mean, is it this year, is it next year, and what if it doesn't happen during Governor Brown's tenure?
So water projects are big, they're expensive. When we built the Colorado River project, we started in 1928 and didn't deliver a drop of water until 1941. We started on this iteration of a Delta fix, a Delta solution. I would peg 8 years ago, although many people want to go back to 1930 or 1960 or both. Let's say 8 years is when we started in earnest, when we just had finished the Delta Reform Act package. So it's like, and then meanwhile, assuming we get a go this year, it's likely to be a decade or so of construction. So it's going to be a long process. I think, though, the timing is critical now to make a decision. You have 6 months left in the Obama administration. At the end of this year, you'll have 2 years left in the Governor Brown administration. We either need to make a decision on whether or not we're going to finish this type of project and move forward on it. I believe, within the next 6 months of the Obama administration on the federal side, and then make progress during the next 2 years in the Brown administration.
Why do you need water from Northern California? You've got the ocean. Why can't you do desal plants? Why is there not enough storage and groundwater in Southern California, in your view?
So, a simple reaction is there's a simple truth that the coast areas where people do like to live in California simply don't have enough water. San Francisco essentially imports all of its water from the Sierras. Santa Barbara has to import water. The East Bay, Oakland, they all import water. And you go up and down the coast. The coast is not where fresh water is, it's where salt water is. Same is true with Southern California. We have good groundwater basins in Southern California. We have some local rainfall, but the most it can do is about half our demand. And so if you're going to have a growing and vital economy in Southern California, you're going to have some element of imported water. Now, the technology is there to do ocean desalination, but I don't think people sometimes get the scales and volumes of water. Southern California just completed in Carlsbad in San Diego County the largest desalination plant in the West Coast, and it will do about 50,000 acre-feet of water a year. On average, Metropolitan can get from the State Water Project, back when it was functioning better than it is today, about 1.5 million acre-feet of water. So to replace that and say, let's say Southern California will no longer import any water from Northern California, we're going to switch all to ocean desal. The comparable would be to build the largest desal plant ever built in the world every 4 miles between Los Angeles and San Diego. You'd have to basically industrialize the whole coast. It took 10 years to get the Carlsbad permits done for 50,000 acre-feet. Well, we need 30 of those done. So it isn't physically or fiscally feasible or practicable to just sort of say, we're going to roll off one system all onto another technology. They all have to be built, and they all have to complement each other.
So if water stopped flowing today, the big earthquake comes, the delta's is inalterably changed by an earthquake, for example. What does Southern California do? What do you do?
So, like any agency, we plan for things like natural disasters. We plan for earthquakes. So one of the things we do is we store water in Southern California to get through droughts, but we also store water for earthquakes. At all times in Southern California, my agency has worked to maintain 6 months' supply of water as an earthquake emergency strategic reserve, that we always have 6 months of water in Southern California that we don't touch in droughts. That is intended to buy us enough time to go patch and fix the system and get water flowing again. That's 6 months supply. Then on top of it, of course, we build our drought reserves that we pull down in droughts. So Metropolitan has the ability to store in its various reservoirs and groundwater banks up to about 5 million acre-feet of water a year, and we need to sell about 1.82 million acre-feet. So you see, you can store several years' worth of supply. When we went into this drought in 2010, Metropolitan had its 600,000 acre-feet of earthquake reserves and about 2.5 million acre-feet of drought reserves. We're now down to less than 1 million, so we've had to pull it down to deal with drought. But that's how it's supposed to work. But that emergency reserve is what we want to give us enough time to go fix the break.
You're in the process of trying to buy the Delta Islands, 5 islands, right? And you know, there is such a level of suspicion about that. And to what do you attribute that? And is there anything you can, tell to those of us who live in the Delta or near the Delta well, any comforting words?
Why are you buying it?
Yeah, so I think the synopsis
It's a
is
very
why
good
are we
question.
buying it?
Yeah.
You expounded on it a little. So
Yeah.
there are, we're buying essentially 20,000 acres. It's portions of essentially 4 islands. These are islands all in the Delta. They are currently being used for either farming or pasture today. But the plan by the owner, which is a Swiss insurance firm, their long-term game plan is to turn 2 of them into reservoirs, capture water, market and sell that to places like Southern California. That is the business plan they have. What we are looking for are ways to get more habitat restoration taking place in the Delta. And a lot of people go, you're a water agency, what do you care about habitat restoration? Well, Metropolitan has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Colorado River restoring habitat. The reason we do that is it's in our self-interest. We get constantly sued and challenged and shut down by fish agencies if the environment isn't doing well. We have the ability to operate, move water, run our system when the species are doing well. So we want species to do well so we can continue to do our mission and our job. We've been talking about restoring 8,000 acres in the Delta for about the last 10 years. And I think we're on about acre 100. Something has to start to happen. We went to our board. The Swiss insurance company said, we're tired of trying to chase a water project. Would you guys be interested in the water project? We said, not particularly in the water project, but we are interested in the asset, the land. We have to start getting the habitat, start to get restoration. We have to start getting the species better so we can continue to do our job. So we said, let's go buy this, make this happen, and see if we can start making some progress.
When you say habitat restoration, isn't that really farmland, moving farmland out of production?
Potentially some of it. You do have 2 islands that are pasture. You have a small piece in the northwest area of the delta called Chips, a small portion of that. That Chips piece looks like it would be perfect for marsh habitat. Some of the islands in the heart of the delta that are pretty below sea level that are being used for farming, maybe not so much good for fish habitat, but on the other hand, there could be farming operations that would work in conjunction with fowl and other bird species that, we've seen a lot of great work on a neighboring island called Mandeville Island, where they brought back, thousands of duck species and things like that. So there's opportunities there that we'd like to explore.
How much farmland are you talking about taking out of production, do you think?
Don't know. Really don't know at this point in time. And some of it, be really candid, is we don't really know if there is going to be a Delta Tunnels project. If there is a Delta Tunnels project, two of the islands potentially could be valuable for staging equipment, doing geotechnical work, all that engineering stuff that an agency like mine does. If there is no tunnel project, then they wouldn't have any value for that. So they'd probably just leave them in farmland.
The congressman who represents the bulk of the Delta, John Garamendi, calls the notion of the tunnels a boondoggle, crazy idea. And he comes up with, and he has alternatives. I mean, how do you get this built over opposition like that from a member of Congress in his district?
Well, I've known John quite a while and worked with him in the past. I worked with him when he was Deputy Secretary of the Interior under Secretary Babbitt, where he was working on Delta projects and ways to improve it. And now he's in Congress, and he represents an area with a very strong viewpoint, and he's doing that as a good elected does. So how do you build any project that has opposition? Almost all projects have some opposition these days. We are a very crowded state. We have 38 million people crammed into this state, and by all projections, we're going to go to 50 million. So when people say, not in my backyard, everything is somebody's backyard today. So you're going to have to find a way to find some give and take and find some degree of consensus, but you're not going to get universal consensus. I think it's a dream to say, not until everyone agrees are we going to move a controversial project forward. If we do that, then the state will be gridlocked and we're not going to get anything done. At some point, you just have to say, this does the most value for the greatest number of people, and we're going to have to move forward with it, understanding that some people will be unhappy with it. But nobody in this state or in this country gets completely run over. There's always mechanisms to mitigate, compensate, and make sure there's a balance in how you move it forward.
If you drive down Interstate 5, invariably you will see signs that say Congress created the Dust Bowl. You will see very angry signs put up by basically Westland's Water District people who are blaming members of Congress, the Endangered Species Act. They are your partner here in some sense in getting the tunnels built. Do you buy the notion that Congress has created this water shortage?
I don't buy the notion that Congress has created a water shortage, but I do think all of us can share some responsibility in not being able to find a solution that works. The Endangered Species Act was written in 1973, and it's a fairly inflexible piece of legislation. But there is flexibility in it to make it work. We did some tremendous work during the Clinton presidency coming up with habitat conservation planning, lots of rules about no surprises and safe harbors and ways to make the law more flexible so that you could do a lot of good for a greater number of species and get projects done. But lately, Congress has been quite polarized. We all watch the news, and people don't want to compromise and find ways to make things work. And that's something I think, Congress, but probably all of us can share in some blame for that.
Yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, an organization, Restore the Delta, put out a press release basically denouncing this event and suggested various questions. So I wanted to read some of these questions. The first one was, why does MWD, this is how it came over in the press release. Why does MWD staff continue to tell MWD board members that the Delta tunnels will provide them more water when it is clear that climate change will lead to less snowpack in the Sierra and reduce flows to the tunnels? Is that clear? I mean, does that,
I understand
the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm happy to answer it. So
Yeah.
that isn't actually what we tell our board. We don't tell our board that building something like the tunnels gets more water. It makes the existing system, the State Water Project, function better. You're basically modernizing and upgrading the existing infrastructure for the purpose of reliability, for making sure that it is reliable. People forget the State Water Project is 1960 engineering. It was state of the art 50 years ago. It is not state of the art today. We need to modernize the system and make it better. That is what the tunnels are intended to do. And we think that's a sound investment in reliability, not in more. If you look at what the City of San Francisco did, City of San Francisco just spent $4 billion on a base of 3 million ratepayers to go completely rebuild their Hetch Hetchy system. Doesn't provide one drop of new water. They essentially tripled the water rates in parts of the city. Why? Because they need reliability, and that's what investments do.
Given the size and scope of this project, and this is related to one of the Restore the Delta questions, why not put this to a vote of the people statewide?
It's actually really rare that you put projects to votes of the people statewide. San Francisco, just right now, they just rebuilt their Hetch Hetchy system. Southern California did not get to weigh in and say whether that was a good idea or not. They were building it, it's their project. Nobody got to weigh in on the Bay Bridge and whether or not that was a good statewide project. No, it just a decision gets made, it gets built. The same was true of, you can start ticking off project after project. It's pretty rare that we go to the statewide voters on projects. And so that would be the norm, not the rule. And that would be the exception, not the norm. And it would also, I think, be I think it's an odd precedent that you would invite people who aren't paying for the project. They're not a beneficiary of it, they aren't a payer, but why not have their opinions on it? That would be kind of dangerous. I mean, I don't think the people of, the Bay Area would maybe prefer that San Bernardino didn't vote on the efficacy of rebuilding the Bay Bridge. That's not really how you would probably want to do things as a wide, diverse state.
Are there any people who feel an urgent need to ask a question? Ginger, perhaps?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about your own ratepayers? Would you put a vote to your own ratepayers?
So Metropolitan has a board of 38 members that represent their ratepayers. And so the plan would be that our board would vote as their representatives as opposed to just going to their ratepayers. It would actually be a very complicated ballot measure to do for our ratepayers because the metropolitan boundary is a very peculiar one. We represent effectively portion of Ventura County, all of Los Angeles County, all of Orange County, all of San Diego County, a portion of Riverside, and a portion of San Bernardino. Effectively, we serve all or portions of 6 Southern California counties, 19 million people, 1 in every 2 Californians we serve water to. But it's never done votes that would have included that 19 million people in a carved out area by itself. So I don't even know how we do it. The plan is that our board will decide. Actually, no. We're a wholesaler. We send bills to 26 wholesale agencies, such as the City of Los Angeles. We send them one bill. They now then go among their 4 million ratepayers and collect that. We don't do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I thought maybe to explain to people why tunnels were even being considered or selected under the Delta. Kind of, why was that?
So the challenge of this whole Delta issue has been known for some time. In 1930, there was a state water plan that was adopted by the California state legislature that basically called for systems to move water from the Sierra water to move it into the Central Valley and open up that area for agriculture. And they proposed a Delta bypass because they knew moving water through the Delta was not going to be a good idea. 1960, when the state adopted the State Water Project, again, it called for a Delta bypass. San Francisco, the East Bay, they all built Delta bypasses. And the reason is, at completely sea level, completely flat area, it's a mixing estuary, it is not a good place to pump. So the plan has always been to build a Delta bypass, but it kept getting put over for expenses or not. Right now, the last time we actually took a statewide vote on the peripheral canal in 1982, that was again a Delta bypass. The thinking now is we've gotten very good at tunneling. We weren't good at tunneling 50 years ago or even 30 years ago.
Peripheral canal failed because the people voted
Sir,
down. and
sir,
that's
sir,
why
wait a
you'll
second.
lose
Wait,
this
wait,
if put
you
it
know-
over a vote. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
So-
Let's not interrupt our guest. Okay, thank you.
So the thinking today is a Delta bypass, but this time tunnels. Less of a footprint. It does bypass the Delta, but it would be done by tunnels. So you'd be a lot less visible, completely out of sight, out of mind once built, and it would be much more effective by gravity flow to be able to move water. So it's a good engineering solution. The real question is, what are the political aspects of it? And obviously that's controversial.
So, sir, you did have a question though, but tell me what your question was.
Well, the question is, why don't you let the people have a vote just like we did on the peripheral canal? The reason probably is you fear it will fail again. Would be my guess to your answer.
So if you want an answer, it's not up to me what the people of the state of California vote on. I run a water district. It'll be up to the governor, the legislature, or that people can run initiatives. That's how things get on the ballot in the state of California. So it's not up to me.
So, which brings us perhaps to the Cortopassi initiative, which is, although Mr. Cortopassi says that his initiative, and for you folks who may not know what it is, this is a measure that would require a statewide vote for any project that uses revenue bonds in excess of $2 billion, if I understand it correctly. Pretty simple initiative, very straightforward. That I suppose could be viewed as a proxy vote on the tunnels. What's your view of that?
Well, our board has taken a position of opposed to the Cortopassi initiative, but I get back to the fundamental principles. Should all the voters of the state weigh in on every project over a certain price tag, even if they aren't a beneficiary of it, and even if they aren't paying for it? Should we have Southern California vote on pick a project, the Bay Bridge, the Hetch Hetchy expansion, Sites Reservoir? You can go on and on and on. There are many, many projects that cost more than $2 billion. They only are going to be paid for by a certain class of citizens. Should other people get to vote on that? That's an important policy question of how we do that.
If the tunnels happen, and if MWD and Westlands and the other users of this pay for it, would it be paid for out of revenue bonds? Would that be the instrument that would be used to pay for this?
Yeah, most likely they'd be revenue bonds.
Yeah. Sir, you had a question? Thanks.
Describing. The other resource that's intimately involved is the flow of water in the rivers that feed it. And those rivers belong to the state and to all of us, and there are a lot more of us than those water-specific end users. And we'd like to vote on it. I would, and I'd like to hear an honest addressing to what this means to using that water. When a river runs dry, it's no longer a river.
So if the tunnels are built, do the rivers run dry?
So right now, there are two projects that pump water from the south of the Delta, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. The concept of building a tunnel is to change where they pump from the south of the Delta to move it about 35 miles north, so that you don't interfere with the tidal movement of water within the Delta. The exact same amount of water is proposed to be lifted out, that is currently being lifted out from the south end of the Delta, would now be lifted out from two places, a little bit in the north and then from the south, and the volumes would be the same. So the amounts of water in rivers are going to be the same. There's going to be some change in the hydraulics of that 35-mile gap where the tunnels pick it up. So, you know, there should not be a change.
Is that so that you're picking up cleaner water, less saline water than you are currently picking up?
So there's a number of reasons why, and there's about 3 or 4 reasons why that, from a technical solution, why it's appealing. One is the water is definitely cleaner and less saline, and that is very important in terms of how you treat water and the human health impacts of that. So that's a very important benefit. The other is, right now, because the water has to move through the Delta, we are interfering with the tidal estuary flows in the Delta, and when we interfere with that, we do harm to the endangered species fish, and therefore we get our pumping restricted. That's 2. Third, very important, is that whole Delta area is a seismic vulnerable area that has the potential to have earthquakes interrupt the flow of water by tunneling down below 150 feet below the surface, building concrete, steel infrastructure pipes that are much safer in an earthquake. You build a safer, more reliable system. So there's 3 major reasons.
Brackish water, because you're extracting it farther up in the Sacramento River, instead of the brackish water you're currently getting, that necessarily leaves the Delta more brackish because it's not getting the fresh water that it's currently getting. That is harming the Delta.
So technically, it actually is, if that were a goal to approach original natural conditions, that is what you would do.
So one of the
So technically, it actually is returning to the Delta to its more natural pre-project state that is running fresh water through it and turning it into a more natural condition that in theory is good for the endangered native fish. But there is a couple of percent, it's a relatively minor amount, but it's a couple of percent change in brackishness at certain times of year. And to the extent there are impacts, that's where you have to mitigate for those and make sure those people are made
So
whole.
you're saying the Delta should be more brackish than it is right now to approach its original natural condition?
If that were a goal to approach an original natural condition, that is what you would do.
So one of the issues here, I think, is Sites Reservoir. You mentioned it. What's MWD's view of Sites Reservoir? Is its construction dependent on a conveyance on tunnels?
So for those who are unaware, Sites Reservoir is a proposed new storage facility that would be built on the northwest side of the Sacramento Valley, so going up north. And it would be an off-stream reservoir, which means it's not built on a river, damming up a river, but rather you find a nice basin area, put up a couple of dams to capture water, and you have to pump in all the water that would not be flowing through a river into it. It's very similar to a project that Metropolitan finished building in 2000. We call it Diamond Valley Lake in Southern California, in the Riverside area, where we built an off-stream reservoir. But for Diamond Valley Lake, Southern California would have been in a world of hurt during this this recent drought, because that enabled us to get through the drought. So off-stream reservoirs are very good, low environmental impact, great for storing and capturing water. So Sites Reservoir, from the MWD perspective, looks like a good, sound project. The problem is, for us, it's north of the Delta. And right now, we can't move water through the Delta because we are so restricted in our ability to move water that it wouldn't provide any real benefits to anyone south of the Delta. It would still be valuable to people north of the Delta. Now, the problem is, the people north of Delta say, we'd like you to help fund it. And I said, well, the problem is I don't know why I would fund it unless I could get some of that water, and I can't actually get the water unless we build a conveyance system. So we have a little bit of a chicken and an egg issue there.
I wonder if you could just step back for 1 second. I see your hand up there, sir. I'll get to you next. But tell me a little bit about the demographics of MWD. How many people live there, and who are they?
I'm not going to name them all.
No, I don't want to know them all,
No.
but just,
So-
I mean, who are we talking about here?
So MWD, I've done a lot of government work over the years, and MWD is a fascinating institution in the sense, unlike most governmental institutions, we don't really have a border. We define ourselves as the Southern California coastal plain. And so we're the southern part of Ventura County, all of Los Angeles, all of Orange, all of San Diego, and then the western portions of San Bernardino and Riverside counties. This is sort of the mountains that ring Southern California into a coastal basin. And it's sort of that coastal basin that people have settled in. It's 19 million people. It's 1 in every 2 Californians crammed into there. So you got a sense of our traffic. It is probably about 60 to almost 60% of the state's entire economy. So incredibly diverse economy, movies and all the show business and high tech, Silicon Beach area they call it. So it's just, it's a huge, it's basically 1 in every 2 Californians. Incredibly, like all of California, incredibly culturally, ethnically diverse region. With the major cities, city of Los Angeles, but we also have city of San Diego, Anaheim, Riverside, Fullerton, et cetera.
One of the fundamental issues here is species and endangered species, Delta smelt and various runs of salmon. Do you believe that the Delta smelt, A, are worth saving, and B, can be saved? And do you think the same question has to do with the endangered salmon fisheries?
So our board strongly supports the Endangered Species Act, and they tell us that anything Metropolitan has to do, everything we do, has to be done in the most environmentally responsible manner we can do it. It's built into our mission statement. It's what our board, kind of puts its money where its mouth is. We spend millions upon millions of dollars on environmental restoration and protection of species. That said, I don't know if we know enough and are smart enough to frankly save some species in the face of climate change. Climate change is real. It's going to have true dynamic changes to the water system, which will have real long, serious impacts on species that rely on cold water as we have a less snowpack, such as the salmon. Delta smelt, a couple of degrees change starts to just drive them out of all their habitat. So the real driver of endangered species is climate change in California, and it's coming at us, and it may dwarf all our ability to manage it with all our tools, but we're just going to have to continue to try hard.
Sir, back in the back there, please.
I find it rather interesting. I remember I don't remember, I read about the Tennessee Valley Authority. Did the people of Tennessee vote on that when we develop our atomic sources? And the great dams that we developed in the state of Nevada and the whole western area. What really brought me here was a question I think your logic is great, Mr. Speaker. Who owns the water? I think that's the underlying, that's the phantom head that we are not bringing forward.
It's a terrific question.
I think you have a tremendous methodology in your development. That's the question.
The people of the state of California own the water. What water users have is a right to use the water, and that is what a water right means. It's we have lots of nice lingo terminology for it, but you have a right to use the water. But the water is owned by the people of the state of California, and they do have a doctrine, the public trust doctrine, where you have to protect the public trust. You have to protect the public's interest in the water, and that can trump a water right's right to use the water.
But doesn't the federal law trump state law and local law?
Now you're getting into a complex issue. And so I think I'm trying to figure out how not to dive into all the weeds of, yes, federal law can preempt state law, but the federal law does respect state water rights. And then there are all sorts of local water rights as well. I'll leave it at that.
But do water rights live forever in perpetuity, do they? Just like the 13th and 14th Amendment.
They can.
They can, really,
Forever?
forever. All right.
For a long
For as long as we're alive, I guess. Sir, back there?
Yeah. What's frustrating here is I think there's not the lack of water, it's just how we manage it. I understand the Sacramento River was running at flood stage through most of December and January this year, and I understand the pumps were being throttled back at that time. Now, is that because of the endangered species, or is that due to you do not want silt put into your pipeline or your system?
Endangered species drove all that throttling back this year. One of the interesting things, so I work around the West a lot on water issues, particularly because of Metropolitan's strong interest in the Colorado River. Colorado River has an annual flow of something like 15 million acre feet. 7 states rely on it, as well as 2 countries, United States and Mexico, 7 states and 10 Indian tribes. And we're dividing up 15 million acre feet there to be shared amongst all those entities. In California, we have 2 to almost 3 times the flow of the Colorado River water, and 1 state to share it in. And believe me, Arizona and Nevada are kind of jealous and frankly bitterly resentful at times. And they're just saying, and yet you can't seem to solve anything within California. And I go, that's because we're debating amongst ourselves. It's really hard.
So is there a way that we can work around that issue?
I think you touched on it first, that there is water in California. We are not an arid state, much like Arizona and Nevada. It's how you manage and what the choices you make, and that's where the political decision-making process comes in.
The legislators from Southern California, particularly Speaker Rendon, Senate President Pro Tem De Leon, both from LA, haven't been particularly active in the discussion. Rendon carried legislation related to water in his first year, but on the question of tunnels, they have not engaged. If the Southern California legislators aren't going to engage in this, why should Northern California?
Perhaps then we, if all the legislators didn't engage, that maybe would be that could be quite.
That would be a good
that
thing.
Might be a good thing. No, I don't think that. Speaker Rendon was very active in pushing forward a water bond. But what you're asking is, should they engage in debate on the tunnels? There actually is no legislation on the tunnels there, and so legislators typically debate what's actually before them to debate, as opposed to something that is maybe of statewide interest, but is not before the legislature.
One way you can get a very quick no comment is to ask a Southern California legislator, what do you think of the tunnels? If they're not going to engage on this issue, why should we?
No comment. No. Sorry, that was too easy.
Yeah. Ginger.
One of the questions that keeps being raised by those in the north who are suspicious of this project is it's going to be paid for by your ratepayers, NWD, but there's a thought that most of the water benefits will be going to Westlands and those, the valley farmers, that the farmers are getting the biggest benefit out of this, and that where this water is going to grow almonds in, Westlands that we ship to China or something, and that there's not really a lot of water that's going to go to those folks in LA and Orange County and so forth who will be paying the bulk of the cost. What's your answer to that charge?
So hopefully people were able to hear that, but basically is, for instance, my agency that represents the large population base, are we basically going to be subsidizing the agricultural agencies and paying their share? They'll get the lion's share of the benefits, And, you know, my agency, the people will get the lion's share of the cost. Interesting, you know, one thing I think that a lot of people don't understand, Metropolitan, the amount of water Metropolitan takes out of the Delta is equivalent to 4% of all the water that goes into the Delta, 4%. And for that, we're supplying the drinking water for 1/2 of the state's population. So it's a pretty remarkable, efficient operation we're trying to run and maintain. And people in Southern California have done a good job of conserving and maintaining a flat water use as our population has grown. What the current plan on the table, though, is that we're going to pay bucket for bucket. So if Southern California gets 25% of the water that moves through the tunnel, Southern California will pay 25% of the cost. The water is going to follow the money's going to follow the water. If Westlands gets 25% of the water, they would be on the hook for 25% of the cost. Now, there's a lot of debate in the farming community whether they can afford that or not, and they'll have to make that decision. But that is the plan, that there isn't intended to be an urban to ag subsidy to make this happen.
If the,
Is there one currently?
I'm sorry, Ginger, I didn't hear you.
Is there one currently?
One what?
Are your urban customers subsidizing Westlands?
No, we are not. And the intent is not to do that.
If the farmers in Westlands and Kern, et cetera, don't pony up their share, would MWD do it on its own?
I don't believe so. I mean, what we've done here as develop, the state of California, working with the federal government, has come up with a California Delta plan, not a metropolitan Delta plan. It's a California-wide plan that benefits about 23, 24 million Californians, of which we represent 19 million, but there's another 4 or 5 million out there that we don't represent, and would provide water to about 4 million acres of farmland going down the Central Valley that we have nothing to do with. That is the plan that's on the table. And if those people, for the 4 million acres and the other 4 or 5 million people, choose not to opt in and do it, I don't see any chance that the Metropolitan Board would say, well, we'll fix this for all of California. It's just not this politically feasible.
Sir, you've been very patient, thank you.
Hey, 64 years ago, I was a young engineer working on the Delta, a young civil engineer. And you mentioned climate change several times tonight. Now, I think, as an engineer, that sometime before the next 64 years go by, climate change caused with the ocean rising, the Delta Islands continuing to subside as they have been, the levees are going to be overcome, the whole smear case is going to be out, and you won't be able to get a drop of water across the Delta to send south. Has your MWD analyzed that possibility at all?
Yeah. Yes, and
what's your conclusion?
And our conclusion is that you're going to see greater and greater saltwater intrusion moving into the Delta. You're going to see all the impacts of bigger storm surges and all these things coming from climate change. More volatile conditions as snowpack turns into rain. All of these things, to our mind, point to you have to do a lot of things. You have to be a lot more local reliant as you can. You have to develop your groundwater basins, your brackish.
You're shifting off the...
No,
he's answering
just let me
your
finish,
question,
please.
sir.
Just let me finish. That's one of the things you have to do, the things that locally. But you're going to have to build more robust infrastructure, meaning larger size facilities to capture peak flows, tunnels that go north and go further out of the area of seawater intrusion. To my mind, you're going to have to build that infrastructure that climate change is going to call for, or relocate millions of people. Those are your options.
If nothing happens, the status quo, how does that affect the Delta in 20 years?
I don't think what you have currently in the Delta is sustainable without making significant changes in how we operate. These islands can't survive climate change, and they can't be 20 feet below sea level in certain areas. We're going to have to find ways to rebuild them. We're going to have to find a better functioning habitat system for species, or we're going to continue to spiral down.
I don't think you're gonna be able to find enough money to keep those levees up when climate change hits. And I'm sure that MWD knows that. And you haven't answered my question about what are you gonna do when you can't get a drop of water across the delta because the levees have collapsed.
So the game plan we have is two things. One, build long-term infrastructure such as tunnels or a delta bypass so that in the event of a collapse you are protected and secure. The second thing is we have to build a system that can manage that collapse. We have been working on emergency response paths that would be able to come in, rebuild key levees, rebuild parts of the system, try and get some water system up and running within 6 months to maybe 18 months at the outside in the response as an earthquake, natural disaster, storm surge response. So we do have emergency response plans. The state of California is stockpiling emergency materials, rock, etc. You know, we do plan for emergencies. Sometimes you get overwhelmed.
Well, I think,
He's
All
got
right.
a question.
I'll do
Let's
it.
move on.
So, I'm sorry it's complicated, of course it is. State Water Project, Oroville Water, I kind of get it, right? Your partner in this is the Bureau, the Central Valley Project, and Folsom is the Central Valley, and the CVP has been on the short end of a whole bunch of things. The CVPIA took $800,000, the Trinity decision, and so that whole system seems to be collapsing, and Folsom seems to be on the short end of the stick. And that's without Westlands getting their full supply. You know, help us understand. I understand you're not a CBP contractor, but if you could speak on their behalf just for a minute and tell us how we should take some comfort in what's going to happen at Folsom if the Bureau stays in the project and Westlands gets their equal share of the pie.
All right, so that is, Einer's really getting to truly insider baseball here on the system. And what you have here is we have a very complicated system, reservoirs being operated around California for lots of purposes. Originally, these systems were built to supply water for urban and agricultural purposes. And now we have layered on all our existing infrastructure a duty to maintain water quality and endangered species mitigation. So Shasta is a very large reservoir in the Central Valley Project in Northern California. It's got about almost 4 million acre feet of water in it right now. They are releasing something like 9,000 cubic feet per second to maintain various flows in the system. Folsom, a relatively small reservoir, has 700,000 acre feet of water in it at the moment, and it's releasing 5,000 CFS a day, meaning it's about 1/25th or 20% of Shasta, but it's doing more than half of the lifting to maintain flows for species. Why? Because they want to preserve the cold water for salmon. And so the federal agencies and fish agencies have decided to put most of the burden on Folsom, and that's a strong local concern here where people rely on Folsom. It has nothing to do with this project, has nothing to do with the State Water Project. It has everything to do with how we manage our system to protect endangered species. So does this project fix that? No, it doesn't. What are we going to have to do? We're going to have to get more robust systems in there to deal with the habitat issues. We're going to have to get in and work with the State Water Board and work with the fish agencies. How do you want to manage this? Right now, if it's all salmon, then why are we releasing all the water from Folsom today to protect that? But again, separate from this project and also separate from the State Water Project, and they aren't going to solve that issue. They aren't to blame for it either.
You for sponsoring this talk and for venturing into less than friendly territory and answering all questions. I appreciate that. My question's about the Delta Islands that Metropolitan, I guess, will perhaps be closing on as soon as maybe the end of this week or days thereafter when the courts have their final say on this. But my question to you as an absentee landowner in the Delta, what does it mean to Metropolitan to be a good neighbor?
It's a great question. Thanks.
That is a good question. So what does that mean to be a good neighbor for us as we would be? I guess you could look at it as an absentee landlord. So yeah, I think that's certainly not an unfair characteristic. What we want to do is to figure out what is a good value use of that land in a way that also doesn't interfere with, has any impacts on locals and the neighbors. Metropolitan owns 20,000 acres in the Palo Verde Valley, which is over by Blythe on the Colorado River. We have owned half of that land since the early 2000s, so for about 15 years now. We have worked very closely with both the city and community there, as well as the local water district there too. We've maintained it in farming, but we've also fallowed parts of it to move water to us. We meet with them regularly to tell them our plans and try to make sure that it works in a way that works for both the community and for us. There's been tensions at times. I mean, though sometimes they feel we're operating it a little too much for a water benefit, and they'd like to see more of a community benefit. And we listen to that and try to work closely with them. So that was what our board has said. We want to find ways that we can use this land, assuming we actually do close on this land, in a way that is locally beneficial and provides benefits to us. And we would want to hear from the community. Are we being successful in doing that?
So how will they be able to reach you?
Gmail.
Sir, you've been very patient. I appreciate it. What's your question?
Every scientific panel, ranging from the Delta Independent Science Board to the EPA, federal scientists, have issued extremely critical reports about the so-called science behind the Delta tunnels. They conclude that the tunnels, if they are built, are likely to hasten the extinction of Central Valley steelhead, winter run Chinook salmon, Delta and longfin smell, green sturgeon, and other species. And they conclude that rather than restoring the Delta, that the tunnels would actually lead to the destruction of the Delta. And this is the scientists across the board, ranging from state scientists to federal scientists. How do you possibly support this project if it doesn't have any scientific basis according to all the available science?
All right, so that's simply not accurate. National Academy of Scientists, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife have all said this is the type of project that needs to get built if you want to take care of the endangered species fish. It doesn't answer every other issue, but most of the scientific actual balance has been that you need to have some form of delta bypass if you're going to protect native species fish. That actually has been the scientific consensus. Then you get into debates on lots of other issues and impacts as well.
43 pages.
Totally different and mostly focused on water quality, not endangered species fish.
It focused on, oh, no, that's not true.
Well, then we disagree.
That's a false statement. 43
Totally
pages.
different and mostly focused on water quality, not endangered species fish,
It
which
focused
are...
on, no, that's
All
not
right,
true.
well, then we disagree.
That's a false statement.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have come up on an hour. You know, you've been really patient. You've raised your hand a couple times. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question, then we'll call it a wrap.
With all due respect, you pointed to the Bay Bridge as something that wasn't a statewide referendum, but that's kind of a half-truth. We did vote statewide on a referendum and a bond issue for earthquake retrofit, which then funded part of the Bay Bridge retrofit in the new. It's a small component, but it really was a statewide decision.
Mm-hmm.
Now, having said that, I'm not necessarily a supporter of a statewide referendum on this issue. It's pretty complex. Can you speak to, I understood at least in the old peripheral canal plan, really what that amounted to was a manifold. we were going to inject fresh water at strategic points and improve water quality in the delta. The tunnels have the same component. I mean, you really haven't talked about how people don't really understand how it's going to improve things. All they see in it is a large conduit to pump more water.
Really good question. The actual old peripheral canal was actually going to be designed with the ability to move 23,000 cubic feet per second and then deliver at about 10,000 cubic feet per second to the pumping plants. And the concept was that the canal would drop off water throughout the delta and add fresh water throughout the delta to make it much fresher for agricultural purposes. That was good logic in 1982 thinking. All the thinking today is we've learned now that salmon want to follow the water molecules that they're from, and all we'd be doing is driving all the salmon species extinct, as they would, instead of going north, they'd be going south and following the manifold. So California Fish and Wildlife actually was one of the strongest agencies to say we don't want that type of freshening of the delta. That is bad scientific planning that was the best thinking at the time in 1982 is now considered exactly what we do not want to do. So this project is not going to do that. The idea is that we're going to allow for a much more natural interface in the delta of water moving east to west, and the north-south moving water would go into tunnels and be completely separated from it to allow a much more natural system for fish species. That's the best thinking today in 2016, and I'm sure in 2050 people will be going, boy, I wish we'd done something different, but that's our best thinking today.
You've all shown why it's so difficult to write about water for the Sacramento Bee, because you all know so much about it. And we're writing to very engaged and intelligent people, and I know that I really appreciate it. It's much different, I think, maybe from our fellow Californians in Southern California, who having worked down there for a while, the impression I get is most people think water comes from the tap. We're a little more connected to it here. And it's important. It's one of the reasons we live here, I think. Jeff, if there's any closing comments you want to make, please make it. But my closing comment is I really appreciate you taking the time to answer some of these smart people's questions. And I'm sure you'll stick around if the woman back there has a question. And
my only closing comments, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. I take no offense whatsoever at anybody's comments or questions. That is what I'm paid to do. It's what I'm supposed to do, and I get it. This is a controversial issue, and people have strong feelings about it, and that's normal and right. The only thing I would say is I'm pretty rare in the sense that I'm actually an 8th generation Californian. My kids are 9th generation. If one of them has a kid at some point, they'll be 10th generation. I grew up my whole life in Southern California. I did all my schooling in Northern California. I tend to think of this place as one state, and we ought to try and solve these things best we can together. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thanks a lot.
And they stay during the entire time, and they're there. Okay, I'm going to go down there.
In fact, the man used to